It was a bright afternoon when Officer Greg Henson cruised down the streets of an upscale neighborhood. The sun reflected off the polished hoods of parked cars, and the roads were quiet, lined with tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything seemed peaceful, the kind of place where he believed only certain people belonged. As he drove past a row of large houses with perfectly trimmed lawns, his eyes locked onto a sleek black SUV moving steadily along the road. The vehicle looked brand new, expensive, something that caught his attention right away. But it wasn't just the car that made him narrow his eyes. It was the driver. A black woman, alone, behind the wheel. Henson frowned. He had been patrolling this area for years, and in his mind, he could tell who lived here and who didn't. Something about the woman's presence made him curious. Was she visiting someone? Was she lost? Or was there something more to the story? His assumptions got the best of him. Without any clear reason, he decided he needed to check things out. Flipping on his squad car's lights, he signaled for the SUV to pull over. The vehicle slowed down smoothly before coming to a stop at the side of the road. Henson parked behind it and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he walked toward the driver's side. As he approached, he took a quick look at the car. No visible signs of a traffic violation. The woman inside had done nothing wrong. But that didn't matter to him. He had already made up his mind that he needed to question her. The driver rolled down her window, her expression calm, her posture relaxed. She looked directly at him, waiting for him to speak. "License and registration," Henson said, his voice firm. The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. She reached for her purse, pulled out her wallet, and handed him her driver's license along with the car's registration. Henson took them, but barely glanced at the details before speaking again. "This your car?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. The woman remained composed, her voice even. "Yes, it is." Henson studied her face, waiting for any sign of nervousness, but there was none. She wasn't fumbling with her words, wasn't avoiding eye contact, wasn't acting like someone who had something to hide. That should have been the end of it. A quick check, a polite nod, and he could have let her go. But something inside him refused to drop it. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the need to assert control. Whatever it was, he wasn't done yet. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. The woman's expression didn't change. "Driving," she answered simply. Her response was short, direct, and confident. It caught Henson off guard. He was used to people explaining themselves, justifying their presence when he asked questions like that. Instead, she had given him nothing to work with. He shifted his stance. "Where are you coming from?" She let out a small sigh, as if she had dealt with situations like this before. "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" Henson's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not like this. He ignored her words and looked down at the license in his hand, reading the name. Something about it seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "You live around here?" he asked. The woman gave a small nod. "I do." Henson glanced at the address on the registration. It matched the neighborhood. That should have been enough proof. But still, he hesitated. "Step out of the vehicle," he said suddenly. For the first time, the woman's expression changed slightly. Not fear, not anger, but something closer to quiet disappointment. She studied him for a moment before unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out of the SUV. She stood tall, shoulders back, completely at ease. There was no panic, no protest, no argument. She looked directly at Henson, holding his gaze, as if waiting for him to realize something. Henson stared back, gripping the license tighter in his hand. There was something about her presence, something about the way she carried herself that made him second-guess his assumptions. But his pride kept him from backing down. "Wait here," he ordered, stepping back toward his car. He needed to run her information, needed to make sure everything checked out. Even as he walked away, a small voice in the back of his mind was starting to whisper, had he just made a mistake? The woman remained where she was, standing patiently on the sidewalk, watching him. There was no fear in her eyes. If anything, there was a quiet confidence, as if she already knew exactly how this was going to end. And in just a few minutes, Officer Henson would find out why. Officer Greg Henson stood by his patrol car, gripping the woman's license in his hand. Something about her confidence unsettled him, but he refused to show it. He was the one in control here. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. He glanced back at the woman, who remained standing next to her SUV. She didn't fidget. She didn't look nervous. She just watched him with calm, steady eyes. It was unusual. Most people, especially during an unexpected traffic stop, showed at least some signs of discomfort. They would shift their weight, glance around, or rush to explain themselves. But this woman, she stood there as if she had all the time in the world, as if she knew exactly how this was going to play out. Ignoring the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine, Henson turned back to his squad car and sat inside. He typed her name into the system, waiting for the results to pop up. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen her name somewhere before. It nagged at him, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He had been in law enforcement for years, long enough to remember names that mattered. But before he could piece it together, the system loaded her profile. His eyes scanned the screen quickly. Everything checked out. Her license was valid. The car was registered in her name. The address matched a house just a few streets away. Legally, there was nothing wrong. He should have ended the stop right there. But instead, something inside him pushed back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the simple fact that he had already gone this far, and backing down now would feel like admitting he had made a mistake. He wasn't ready to do that. Henson stepped out of his car and walked back toward her, his face unreadable. He handed her license and registration back, but he didn't step away. He wasn't finished. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice sharp. The woman didn't answer right away. She took her time placing her documents back into her purse. Then, with the same calm tone, she finally responded, "Is there a reason you need to know that?" Henson's fingers twitched. He wasn't used to people pushing back like this. Most would just answer, hoping to get the situation over with as quickly as possible. But this woman wasn't rushing. She wasn't afraid. "I'm just asking a question," he said, his voice a little tighter now. "And I'm wondering if I need to answer it," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time since the stop began, Henson felt like he was the one being questioned. He didn't like it. He straightened his posture, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "Look," he said, his tone more forceful now. "I pulled you over because I needed to check something." She raised an eyebrow. "And did you find a problem?" He hesitated. "No," he admitted, but then quickly added, "But I'm just making sure everything is clear." The woman let out a small breath, almost like a laugh, but not quite. "Everything is clear, officer." That should have been the end of it. He should have told her to have a nice day and walked away. But something about her composure irritated him. It made him feel like he was losing control of the situation, and he wasn't ready to let that happen. "Do you live around here?" he asked again, this time more forcefully. She sighed, as if she had been through this routine before. "Yes, I already told you that." Henson clenched his jaw. He knew he was dragging this out longer than necessary, but he couldn't stop himself. He had started something, and now he felt the need to finish it. "Look, you might not think this is a big deal," he said, crossing his arms, "but I have a job to do. If something seems suspicious, I check it out. That's how I keep this neighborhood safe." The woman's expression didn't change. She looked at him for a moment, as if deciding how to respond. Then, finally, she spoke. "Officer, I understand that you have a job to do," she said evenly. "And I respect that. But right now, you're making assumptions that aren't based on anything real." Henson felt his face heat up. "I'm just doing my job." She tilted her head slightly. Are you? The question hung in the air between them. Henson didn't know why, but something about the way she asked it made him feel exposed, like she could see through him. Before he could think of a response, she reached into her purse again, not in a hurried way, not in a nervous way, but with complete confidence. Henson stiffened slightly, but he didn't stop her. A second later, she pulled out a sleek black leather case and flipped it open. And then, in just a single moment, everything changed. The moment his eyes landed on what was inside, his breath caught in his throat. There, staring back at him, was a gold federal badge with bold, unmistakable letters. Federal Bureau of Investigation. And right beneath it, her full name. For the first time during this stop, Henson was the one who felt frozen in place. The woman closed the badge case with a quiet snap and looked him directly in the eyes. "Officer Henson," she said, her voice still as calm as ever, "I think it's time you run my name again. And this time, pay close attention." Henson's stomach twisted. Something told him he had just made a huge mistake. Officer Greg Henson felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the badge in the woman's hand. He had seen many badges before, but this one was different. The gold shield gleamed under the afternoon sun, the letters FBI standing out in bold print. Beneath them was her full name, the same name he had just run through his system. His heart pounded. He had spent the last few minutes talking down to her, questioning her as if she was a suspect. And now he realized she was no ordinary citizen. The woman calmly placed her badge back into her purse and looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no frustration, just a quiet confidence that unsettled him even more. "Run my name again, Officer Henson," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "And this time, make sure you read everything carefully." For a brief moment, Henson considered brushing it off, pretending he hadn't seen the badge. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. His instincts told him he had just stepped into something far bigger than he had anticipated. He swallowed hard and turned back toward his squad car, his hands suddenly feeling unsteady. Sliding into his seat, he entered her name again into the system, this time focusing more carefully on the details. And then there it was. Cassandra Lewis, not just an FBI agent, FBI Chief of Internal Affairs. His stomach dropped. Internal Affairs. The very department that investigated police misconduct. Henson felt his breath hitch as the weight of the situation sank in. This woman wasn't just a federal agent. She was the head of the department that handled cases exactly like this. If she wanted, she could report him right now, and his entire career could crumble in an instant. His palms grew sweaty as he reread the information, hoping he was mistaken. But there was no mistake. The woman he had been interrogating, the woman he had treated with suspicion for no reason, was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. Henson closed his eyes for a second, his mind racing. He thought about every word he had said to her, every action he had taken. The way he had demanded her license without explaining why he pulled her over. The way he had questioned whether the car was really hers. The way he had ordered her out of the vehicle. Every move he had made was now a mistake he couldn't take back. Taking a deep breath, he slowly stepped out of his squad car and walked back toward Cassandra. He tried to compose himself, but he knew it was no use. His face was pale, his throat dry. She had all the power now, and they both knew it. She stood exactly where he had left her, arms crossed, waiting. She didn't say anything as he approached, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Finally, Henson cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. What was he even supposed to say? "Ugh, Mom," he began awkwardly, his tone completely different now. I see that you're, Cassandra raised an eyebrow, waiting. He exhaled sharply. There was no point in pretending anymore. "I see that you're with the FBI." She gave a small nod. "That's right." Henson forced a nervous chuckle, hoping to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. "You should have told me sooner." At this, Cassandra finally reacted. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Should I have?" she asked. Henson blinked, caught off guard. He had expected her to let it go, maybe even laugh about it. But she wasn't letting him off that easily. Cassandra took a slow step forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Tell me, Officer Henson," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "At what point do you think I should have told you? When you pulled me over without cause? When you questioned if this was my car? Or when you ordered me out of the vehicle for no reason?" Henson's face burned with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because she was right. She let the silence sit between them before speaking again. "I didn't tell you sooner," she continued, "because I wanted to see how far you'd take this." Henson's stomach twisted. She had been testing him the entire time. "And now," she added, "you've shown me exactly what I needed to see." His heart pounded. He had no idea what that meant, but it didn't sound good. "Listen, Before he could finish, a voice crackled over his police radio. "Unit 4 to 5, stand down immediately." Henson froze. The voice was sharp, authoritative, and came from someone far above his rank. A second later, the radio spoke again. "Repeat, stand down. You are currently detaining FBI Chief Cassandra Lewis. This order comes directly from the Commissioner." Henson felt like the ground had just been ripped from beneath him. The Commissioner, the highest-ranking officer in the department. Cassandra gave a small, knowing smile. "Now you're starting to get it," she said quietly. Henson swallowed hard. His career had been built on authority, on always being the one in control. But at this moment, he realized something that made his stomach churn. He was no longer in control. She was. And there was nothing he could do to change that now. Officer Greg Henson stood frozen, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a heavy stone. His police radio had just delivered a message that made his stomach twist, a direct order from the Commissioner to stand down. His mind raced. In all his years as an officer, he had never been personally called out by the highest-ranking official in the department. That kind of thing only happened in extreme situations, and now it was happening to him. He swallowed hard and looked at Cassandra Lewis, the woman he had pulled over just minutes ago, thinking she was an ordinary citizen. But now he knew the truth. She was the FBI Chief of Internal Affairs, the very person responsible for investigating misconduct within law enforcement. Cassandra hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she was, watching him with the same calm expression. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't do anything to rub the situation in his face. And that made it even worse, because it meant she didn't have to. The damage had already been done. Henson's hands felt clammy as he reached for his radio, pressing the button with an unsteady thumb. "Copy that," he muttered, his voice tight. "Standing down." Static buzzed for a moment before the dispatcher responded. "Acknowledged." Henson let go of the button and exhaled slowly. He wanted to wake up from this moment, to pretend it hadn't happened. But it had happened, and now he had to face the consequences. He turned back to Cassandra, struggling to find the right words. How was he supposed to handle this? She was the first to speak. "Are we done here, Officer Henson?" Her voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't mocking. It was simply a question, but somehow it carried more weight than anything he had ever heard before. He hesitated. Every instinct in him wanted to fix this, to salvage what little dignity he had left. But the truth was, there was nothing he could say to undo the past few minutes. He finally nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said, forcing the words out. Cassandra gave a small nod in return. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward her car. Just like that. Henson watched as she opened the driver's side door and slid inside. He expected her to speed off, to leave him standing there with his humiliation. But instead, she sat there for a moment, as if thinking. Then, she rolled down the window and looked at him once more. "You know," she said, her tone thoughtful, "you're not the first officer to stop me like this." Henson felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. She continued, And you're not the worst one either. That surprised him. He glanced at her, confused. I'm not. She shook her head. No, you didn't raise your voice. You didn't make threats. But you still acted on assumption rather than reason. Henson clenched his jaw. He knew she was right, but he didn't want to admit it. Cassandra studied him for a moment before speaking again. Tell me, Officer Henson, why did you pull me over? His throat tightened. He knew she already knew the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it. He looked away, his pride fighting against the truth. But after a long pause, he finally muttered, I didn't have a good reason. Cassandra gave a slow nod, as if she had expected that response. That's the problem, she said, and that's why I do my job. Henson's stomach twisted. He had spent years seeing internal affairs as the enemy, the people who got officers fired, who made their jobs harder. But now, standing in front of the FBI chief herself, he saw something different. She wasn't here to make life harder for officers. She was here to make sure they did their jobs the right way. Cassandra sighed, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. I'm not going to file a complaint, she said suddenly. Henson's head snapped up. You're not. She shook her head. Not this time. Relief flooded through him, but before he could speak, she held up a finger. But let me be very clear, Officer Henson, she said. If I ever hear about you doing this to someone else, if I ever see a report that matches what happened here today. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Henson felt his chest tighten. She let the silence settle before continuing. You have a choice, she said. You can learn from this, or you can let it define you. With that, she rolled up the window, shifted her car into drive, and pulled away. Henson watched as her SUV disappeared down the road. He stood there for a long time, his thoughts louder than any siren. For the first time in his career, he questioned himself. Not because someone told him to, not because of rules or policies, but because he realized something about himself that he didn't like. And now, the real question was, what was he going to do about it? Officer Greg Henson sat in his patrol car, staring at the dashboard, but his mind was somewhere else. The weight of what had just happened felt like a stone pressing down on his chest. He replayed the scene over and over in his head. The flashing lights, the stop, the way he had questioned Cassandra Lewis. And then, the way she had turned the entire situation around on him. She had given him a choice. Learn from this, or let it define you. The words echoed in his mind, louder than the police radio buzzing in the background. Henson had always believed he was a good cop. He followed the rules, did his job, and went home at the end of his shift. But today, something felt different. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he had done his job the right way. Taking a deep breath, he reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 4 to 5. I'm taking a break. The dispatcher responded, copy that, 4 to 5. Henson turned off his lights and drove to a small parking lot near a quiet park. He needed a moment to think. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as memories from his past started surfacing. He had been a police officer for nearly 10 years. In that time, he had made hundreds of traffic stops. He had always followed procedure, or so he thought. But now, after today's incident, he started questioning things. How many other times had he acted on assumption rather than reason? He thought back to a stop from a few weeks ago. An older man driving a nice car, looking nervous. Henson had assumed the car was stolen. It wasn't. Or the young guy walking in the wrong part of town late at night. Henson had questioned him aggressively, thinking he was up to no good. But the kid had just been walking home from work. Had he ever truly stopped to think about why he did some of the things he did? Or had he just been following a pattern he never questioned? A knot formed in his stomach. He had never seen himself as someone who judged people unfairly. He had never thought of himself as a bad cop. But today, for the first time, he realized he had been blind to his own actions. He let out a slow breath and rubbed his temples. He could push these thoughts away. He could pretend today never happened. or he could face it. After a few minutes, he pulled out his phone and hesitated before making a call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Henson, what's up, man?" It was Officer Tom Grady, one of his closest friends on the force. "Hey," Henson said, trying to keep his voice steady. I need to talk." Grady chuckled. "That's serious. You sound weird." Henson swallowed. "Yeah, it's serious." A pause. Then, Grady's voice turned more focused. "All right. Where are you?" They agreed to meet at a nearby diner. 20 minutes later, Henson sat in a booth, staring at his coffee. Grady slid into the seat across from him, looking concerned. "Okay, what's going on?" Henson took a deep breath. "I messed up today." Grady frowned. "What do you mean?" Henson hesitated, then told him everything. The stop, the questions, the badge. The realization that he had pulled over the FBI chief of internal affairs. Grady listened without interrupting. When Henson finished, his friend let out a low whistle. "Man, that's rough." Henson nodded. "Yeah." For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Grady leaned forward. "Look, I get it. We've all made bad stops. We're trained to be suspicious. It's how we keep people safe." Henson looked up. "But is that an excuse?" Grady opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer. Henson continued. "What if we've been doing things the wrong way? What if we're not protecting people the way we think we are?" Grady exhaled and rubbed the back of his head. I guess it depends." Henson shook his head. "No, it doesn't. There's right, and there's wrong. And today, I was wrong." Grady looked at him carefully. "So what are you gonna do?" Henson thought about it for a moment. He could pretend this never happened. He could keep doing things the way he always had. Or he could change. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I need to figure it out." Grady nodded slowly. "Well, if you do, let me know. Because maybe I need to figure it out too." The two men sat there in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. For the first time in his career, Henson realized that being a good cop wasn't just about following the law. It was about understanding people, questioning his own actions, and being willing to change. And maybe, just maybe, today was the start of something better. The next morning, Officer Greg Henson sat in his patrol car outside the station, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had been sitting there for nearly 10 minutes, trying to gather his thoughts before stepping inside. Everything felt different now. His uniform still fit the same. His badge still shined under the morning sun. But something inside him had changed. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, that his instincts as an officer were always correct. But yesterday's encounter with Cassandra Lewis, the FBI chief, had forced him to take a hard look at himself. And he didn't like everything he saw. Taking a deep breath, he finally opened the car door and stepped out. As he walked toward the entrance of the police station, he could already hear familiar voices coming from inside. As soon as he entered, a group of officers turned toward him. Among them was Officer Tom Grady, his closest friend. "There he is," Grady said with a grin. "The man who pulled over the FBI chief." A few officers chuckled. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Henson forced a small smile, but he didn't feel like laughing. Another officer, Mark Stevens, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "So what did she do? Give you a hard time? I bet she threatened to have you fired." Henson hesitated. He could lie. He could go along with the jokes, pretend it was just another bad stop, and move on. But he didn't want to do that. "No," Henson finally said. "She didn't threaten me." Stevens raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Henson nodded. "She just asked me to think about why I pulled her over." For a moment, there was silence. Then another officer, Dan Riley, scoffed. "Come on, Henson. We all know how this works. Sometimes, You pull someone over because they look out of place. It's not personal. It's just part of the job. Henson frowned. Yeah, but what if we're wrong? What if we stop people just because of how they look instead of because they actually did something wrong? The mood in the room shifted. Some officers exchanged glances. Others just looked at him. Grady cleared his throat. Henson, are you saying you regret stopping her? Henson exhaled. I'm saying I could have done better. And if I can do better, shouldn't I? The room was quiet again. Then Stevens chuckled and shook his head. Man, you're thinking too much about this. It was just one stop. It's not a big deal. Henson looked at him. It's a big deal to the people we stop for no reason. Stevens rolled his eyes. All right, do what you want. But I'm not changing how I do my job. Henson wasn't surprised by that response. But he also saw that not everyone in the room agreed with Stevens. Some officers were thinking about what he said. And that was enough. For now. A few minutes later, Henson made his way to the captain's office. He had made a decision last night, and he knew he had to follow through. The captain, James Holloway, looked up as Henson knocked on the doorframe. Come in. Henson stepped inside and closed the door. What's on your mind, officer? The captain asked, leaning back in his chair. Henson took a deep breath. Sir, I'd like to request additional training on fair policing practices. Captain Holloway raised an eyebrow. Additional training? Yes, sir, Henson said firmly. After yesterday's incident, I realized that there's a lot I need to learn. I don't want to make assumptions about people. I want to be sure I'm treating everyone fairly. The captain studied him for a moment. Most officers wouldn't ask for this kind of training unless they were forced to. I know, Henson admitted. But I'm not asking because I have to. I'm asking because I want to. Holloway nodded slowly. That's a good attitude, Henson. He paused, then added, You know, a few years ago, we tried offering voluntary bias training. Not many officers signed up. Henson hesitated. Why not? Holloway sighed. Because people don't like to admit that they might be making mistakes. Henson understood that now more than ever. The captain leaned forward. All right, I'll approve the training request. But let me ask you something. Why do you really want this? Henson didn't hesitate. Because I want to be a better officer. And I think that starts with being honest about my mistakes. The captain nodded, a small smile forming. That's a rare thing to hear. I respect that. Henson felt a sense of relief. He didn't know what the training would teach him, but he knew he needed to take the first step. As he walked out of the office, he noticed Grady waiting for him in the hallway. What was that about? Grady asked. Henson took a deep breath. I asked for extra training. Grady's eyebrows lifted in surprise. You serious? Yeah. Grady was silent for a moment. Then he crossed his arms and nodded. You know what? I think I might sign up too. Henson smiled. Maybe change didn't happen all at once. Maybe it wasn't about big speeches or sudden transformations. Maybe it started with small decisions. And today, he had taken the first step toward being the kind of officer he wanted to be. Officer Gray Henson sat in the training room, staring at the large screen in front of him. Around him, a few other officers had gathered, some out of curiosity, some because they had been ordered to attend. Henson was here because he wanted to be. The training was called Fair and Just Policing, Recognizing Bias in Law Enforcement. It was being led by an instructor named Derek Coleman, a former police officer who had spent years studying how bias affected decision-making. All right, let's get started, Derek said, standing at the front of the room. Let me ask you all a question. How many of you believe you're fair when you do your job? Almost every officer in the room raised their hand. Henson hesitated, then slowly lifted his. Derek smiled. Good. That means you believe in what you're doing. Now, let's test that belief. He clicked a button, and a series of images appeared on the screen. They showed different people in different situations. A man in a suit walking down the street, A woman in ripped jeans and a hoodie standing outside a store. A group of teenagers laughing on a sidewalk. "Now," Derek said, "I want you to be honest. Don't say what you think sounds right. Say what you actually feel when you see these pictures. Who looks suspicious?" The room went quiet. Henson stared at the images. He knew the answer. If he had seen the man in the suit walking down the street, he wouldn't have thought twice. But if he had seen the woman in the hoodie or the teenagers hanging out, he might have been more alert. Derek nodded. "It's okay. This isn't about blaming anyone. It's about recognizing how our minds work." He changed the screen to a blank slide. "The truth is," he continued, "our brains take shortcuts. We've seen certain patterns in our lives, and we assume those patterns will continue. It's natural. But in law enforcement, assumptions can lead to mistakes. Mistakes that hurt people." Henson sat up straighter. This was exactly what he had been thinking about for days. Derek continued, "Let's talk about stops. When you stop someone, what's going through your mind?" A young officer, sitting in the back, spoke up. "I'm looking for signs of danger." Derek nodded. "Good. But what if your idea of danger is based on something other than facts? What if it's based on who that person reminds you of, instead of what they're actually doing?" Henson's stomach tightened. That's exactly what happened when he stopped Cassandra Lewis. Derek clicked to a new slide. This time, it showed a chart with data. "This isn't just about opinion," he said. "Studies show that officers are more likely to stop people from certain backgrounds, not because they've done anything wrong, but because of how they look or where they are." Some officers shifted in their seats. Henson saw Grady, sitting across the room, leaning forward. He was paying attention too. Derek continued, "Now, let's get personal. I want each of you to think of a time when you made a stop that didn't feel quite right. A time when, looking back, you wonder if you jumped to a conclusion too fast." Henson didn't have to think hard. He remembered the stop with Cassandra. He remembered the nervous teenager he had questioned for no reason. He remembered the older man in the nice car that he assumed was stolen. He had never thought of himself as unfair, but maybe fairness wasn't about what he believed. It was about what his actions showed. Derek gave them a few moments, then spoke again. "The first step to change isn't feeling guilty. It's being aware. Once you see where you can do better, you have the power to actually do better." Henson nodded slowly. He hadn't expected this training to affect him so deeply, but it did. After the session ended, a few officers left quickly, eager to move on with their day. Others stayed behind, talking in small groups. Grady walked over to Henson. "Well," he said, rubbing his neck, "that was something." Henson looked at him. "Yeah, it was." Grady hesitated. "You know, I've always thought I was doing the right thing, but some of what he said hit me hard." Henson nodded. "Same here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grady sighed. "So what now?" Henson thought for a moment before answering. "I think we just pay more attention. We stop making decisions on autopilot. We ask ourselves if we're being fair before we act." Grady smirked. "You sound like a training video." Henson chuckled. "Maybe. But if it makes us better at our jobs, isn't it worth it?" Grady shrugged. Yeah, I guess it is." As they left the training room, Henson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just responsibility. A week had passed since the training, and Officer Greg Henson found himself thinking differently about his job. Before, he had walked into every shift believing he was doing everything right. Now, he understood that doing things right meant questioning himself too. That morning, as he put on his uniform, he felt a sense of responsibility that was deeper than before. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about enforcing it the right way. When he arrived at the station, he noticed a change, not just in himself, but in some of his fellow officers too. Grady, who had attended the training with him, had been more thoughtful during stops. He was asking more questions before making decisions, rather than just going with his first instinct. Even some of the officers who had brushed off the training were paying closer attention to their actions. Henson knew that not everyone would change overnight, but he had learned something important. Change doesn't happen because of one big moment. It happens in small steps every single day. Later that afternoon, Henson was patrolling near a busy shopping area when he spotted a young man standing near a parked car. The man looked nervous, glancing around as if he was unsure of something. A few weeks ago, Henson might have stopped him immediately, assuming something was wrong. But this time, he did something different. He didn't jump to conclusions. Instead of treating the man as a suspect, Henson approached calmly. "Hey there," he said with a friendly nod. "You okay?" The young man looked up, startled. "Oh, yeah. I'm just waiting for my dad. His car won't start." And he went inside to get some help. Henson could tell he was a little uneasy. Before the training, he might have pressed harder, asked for ID, questioned why he was there. But instead, he smiled. "Gotcha. Car trouble is the worst." The young man relaxed a little. "Yeah, it's an old one. Always acting up." Just then, an older man came out of a store with a worker carrying jumper cables. The young man sighed in relief. "That's my dad." Henson gave a small nod. "Good luck with the car." Then he walked away. It was a simple moment, nothing dramatic, but it was different from how he would have handled it before. And that difference mattered. Later that evening, as Henson was finishing his shift, he got a call from the station. The FBI chief wanted to see him. His stomach tightened. It had been days since he last saw Cassandra Lewis. He wasn't sure what she wanted, but he had a feeling it had something to do with how he had changed. When he arrived at her office, she greeted him with a calm but firm expression. "Officer Henson," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I hear you attended bias training." "Yes, ma'am," he said, sitting across from her. She studied him for a moment. "And what did you take from it?" Henson took a deep breath. "I realized that being a good officer isn't just about following rules. It's about challenging my own thinking. I want to make sure that when I stop someone, it's for the right reasons, not just because they look suspicious to me." Cassandra nodded slowly. "That's what I was hoping to hear." Henson hesitated before speaking again. "I also wanted to say something, Chief Lewis." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry," Henson said, "for the way I treated you when I pulled you over. I assumed things about you without knowing the facts. That was wrong." Cassandra leaned back in her chair. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, a small smile appeared. "Apology accepted," she said. Henson exhaled, feeling lighter. Cassandra continued, "The reason I didn't fight back that day wasn't because I couldn't. It was because I wanted you to see for yourself how your actions affected people." Henson nodded. "I see it now." She studied him for a moment. "So, what are you going to do with what you've learned?" Henson didn't even have to think. "Keep learning. Keep questioning. Keep making sure I treat everyone fairly." Cassandra smiled. "Good answer." She stood and extended her hand. Henson shook it firmly. As he walked out of her office, he felt something he hadn't felt before. Not just relief, not just understanding. Pride. Because real strength wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about being humble enough to grow. And for the first time in a long time, he knew he was on the right path. Not just as an officer, but as a better person.